Most of you know that I grew up in New York City, and the backyard of our house was literally a slab of concrete. When my mom would say to us kids, "Go outside and play," that's where we went, to the slab of concrete. And most of my life since then, I've lived in big cities, in the concrete jungles. And it wasn't until 11 years ago when Greg and I moved to Saugatuck that I was surrounded by nature. Greg and I moved here in Saugatuck in the winter. And that very first spring, I had to go back to New York to take care of my mother, who was ill. And when I returned back to Saugatuck, there were all of these beautiful tulips in front of our house. And I went inside and I thanked Greg, and I said, "That was so thoughtful of you to plant those tulips while I was away. They're beautiful." And he said, "I didn't plant them. The previous owners did." And I said, I'll need to call them and thank them. That was so nice." And he was like, "No, you fool. They planted them years ago." And I remember being astounded by the fact that year after year, winter after winter, the tulip bulbs were still alive. And then I went in our backyard. We had a pond. It was frozen when we bought the house and when I went back to New York to be with my mom. But when I came home, the pond was no longer frozen. And inside the pond were fish. And again, I thanked Greg. I said, "Thank you for going out and buying fish and putting them in the pond." And he said, "Those fish have been there all winter." And again, I was astounded. How could these fish, through the snow and the cold and the ice, still be alive? And for me, honestly, it was a spiritual awakening. It really was this realization where I came to see that the life force that keeps the tulips and the fish alive during that time of darkness is the same exact life force that sustains me through my times of darkness. That cycle of life and death is something we all experience. We look at the trees in the winter and they appear dead. They look barren and lifeless and fruitless. Of course, we know they're still very much alive. And many of us in the winters of our life have felt that way. We have felt barren and lifeless and fruitless. We're still alive, though, even though we appear lifeless. I think, too, of the caterpillar. A caterpillar has to go into the darkness of the cocoon, and it needs to die to being a caterpillar in order for it to transform and to become a butterfly. And everybody in this room has been in the cocoon at some point in their lives. We go through many cocoon moments, many winters in our lives. They're not fun places to be in, but they are necessary for new growth and for new life. That's what the season of spring is all about. I shared with you at the beginning of the Lenten season that the word Lent comes from an Anglo-Saxon word which means spring. No one knows for sure the exact month and day where Jesus died and resurrected. The church purposely chose to put the Lenten season in between winter turning into spring because it's symbolic. It's symbolic of death turning into new life. Many of you are familiar with Rob Bell. Rob Bell founded in Granville, just nearby here in Granville, Michigan, a church many years ago called Mars Hill, which has turned into a megachurch. And Rob Bell has moved on since then to become a multi-million selling author. He's appeared on Oprah and speaks all over the world. Well, Rob Bell has a new book coming out next month. It is called What is the Bible? And in that book, Rob Bell speaks of what I'm talking about. He says, "Look at the seasons. In winter, everything dies. And then in spring, it comes back to life. It literally springs forth." Or take your cells. You have several billion cells in your body right now. They are constantly dying while your body is producing new ones to replace them. Around 300 million cells in your body die and are replaced every minute. Death is the engine of life. All around us, all the time, this death and life rhythm is built into the fabric of all creation. That's what today's gospel story about the raising of Lazarus is all about. That death is the engine of life. We need to die in order to experience new life. Now, this miracle of the raising of Lazarus is Jesus' very last miracle before his own death and resurrection. And as we talked about last Sunday, this story is to be taken symbolically, not literally. I explained last Sunday that this story of the raising of Lazarus only appears in John's Gospel. And John's Gospel was the very last Gospel to be written. It was written more than 100 years after Jesus was born. So you would think that if Jesus raised somebody from the dead, and he did so in front of a bunch of witnesses, that at least one of the earlier gospel writers would have mentioned it. That'd be a pretty big thing, that he brought somebody back from the dead. But I don't think we need to get caught up on this. Whether you take the story literally or symbolically, it still speaks to the same spiritual truths, the same spiritual principles for all of us. So let's look at it together. The story begins by Jesus getting a message that his friend whom he loves is ill. The message comes from Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, and they live in a place called Bethany. Now, as I've told you before, all the names in the Bible are symbolic. The name Bethany means house of sorrow. So from the house of sorrow, Jesus receives a message. Now, every single person in this room symbolically has at one time or another lived in Bethany. All of you at one point or more in your lives has dwelt in the house of sorrow. Some of you are dwelling there right now. You are living in darkness, you're living in despair, you're living in worry and fear, you're living with resentment and blame and shame and guilt. You're residing in Bethany. What do? You do what Mary and Martha does. You send a message to the Christ for help. Notice, however, what Jesus does. When Jesus gets the message that his friend is ill, does he drop everything and go running? No. He actually stays where he was for 2 more days. He's not in any rush. And again, symbolically for us, when we send the message for help, it's God's timetable, not ours. Jesus is not going to allow fear and worry and panic to control the situation. He knows that there is a divine timetable, and he knows that what Lazarus is experiencing is just temporary. So there's no rush. The next step, Jesus gets there. It's 4 days later. Mary and Martha are not happy, and they say to Jesus, "If you were here, our brother would still be alive." How many of us, in our times of darkness, have played the blame game, the what ifs and the if onlys? Jesus, when he hears this, weeps. Jesus feels compassion for Mary and Martha. And God feels compassion for us when we play the blame game. When we say, God, why is this happening to me? There's compassion. Because we have forgotten this power that is within us. We've forgotten our connection. So Jesus wept. But what does Jesus do next? He shows them, he demonstrates for them the power. And he says, take away the stone. It's symbolic. All of us have a stone, an obstacle, something blocking us from stepping into the light, from living life to the full. Your purpose, especially when you're in the tomb in a time of darkness, is to discover what is that obstacle? What is that stone that's keeping me from the light? And to do as Jesus did, to call upon the power of the Christ and to speak truth. Take away the stone. And the next thing Jesus does is he lifts up his eyes, which means he goes to a place of higher consciousness and he says, thank you. Abba, thank you. Thank you for this new life that's on its way. Gratitude. That's the hardest thing for us when we're in a place of sorrow and darkness and despair. It's easy for us to call for help, to send a message to Christ in panic. We play the blame game. But it's hard for us in that moment to say, oh God, thank you. Thank you for the blessings in my life. Thank you for the new life that's on its way. It's hard for us to do that when we're trapped in the tomb. But Jesus then, in a very loud voice, he demands and commands with everything he has. He says, Lazarus, come out. Come out of the darkness. Step into the light. And Lazarus, who's all bound up, becomes unbound and free. That's our story. We hear come out a lot, those of us in the gay community. It's, I came out. Meaning that you were in the closet, in the darkness, in shame and fear. And then you stepped out into your truth, into the light. You removed the obstacle. That's not just for the gay community, that's a story for all of us. That's what this gospel passage is about. It's about saying, look at your life right now. Are you living life to the full? If not, maybe you're dead. What is the obstacle in your way? How can you remove that? How can you become unbound and free? Well, you have the power within you. That's what Jesus demonstrates in this story for us. It's a 3-step process. It's real easy. The first thing you do, step 1, is you send a message. You say, I need help. You call upon the Christ light. You reach out to God. But you don't do so out of panic or worry. You do so out of trust. Step 2 is where after you send the message, you believe that the Christ light, the help of God, is on its way. And you trust in the divine timetable, in it unfolding exactly how it's supposed to unfold. And then you express gratitude for the new life, for the good that's on its way. And then step 3, the stone is removed. You step forth into the light, unbound and free. Jesus would speak of this 3-step process elsewhere in the gospel when he said very simply, ask, believe, receive. It's that simple. But most of us don't believe it, and it's very hard for us to understand when we're going through something that seems impossible. Reverend Kelly Azola said it so beautifully in our words of integration this morning. But she says that when we are in a situation that appears impossible and there's no hope in sight, she says doing the impossible means connecting with the power of God that is acting in us and through us. That's what we are to do. Connect with that power, that force, that life force that is within us. Now, Jesus says in today's gospel story, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is not saying, I, Jesus, the man from Nazareth, the human being, is the resurrection and the life. That's not what he means. He wasn't an ego guy. He's saying, I am is the resurrection and the life. The great I am. That I am existed billions of years before Jesus was even born. That I am is that life force that keeps the tulips alive in the winter. It's the life force that keeps the fish breathing in the bottom of the ponds when it's all frozen over. That I am is the resurrection and the life. Christians have misunderstood this. If you follow Father Richard Rohr's meditations, the ones that he emailed this week, said we've been a religion that's more about Jesusology than Christology. We think that I am the resurrection and the life meant that Jesus was the only one who could access this power. We are to be about the Christ. The Christ is the I am. It's that life force. Jesus was trying to get us in touch with it. When he said, I and the Father are one, he didn't just mean him. He meant we also are one with this power. It's within us. And in our times of darkness, it is there to sustain us and to bring us new life. And so, let us remember that this Lenten season. Next Sunday, Palm Sunday, starts off so joyfully, but then the end of our service next week ends in silence because we are entering Holy Week and Jesus has to move toward his death. But wasn't that beautiful what Reverend Kelly said in our words of integration about the stations of the cross? That as Jesus is going through his time of darkness, there are people to sustain him. Someone washes his face. Someone dries his tears. Someone helps carry his cross. So when we're in darkness, yes, we call upon that power within us, but we also are lifted up and raised by the people in our life who are expressing that Christ power to us. So please know that whatever you're going through, your tomb moments, your cocoon moments, that there is a force. It's within you and it's within the people in your life that can raise you up and lift you up from being hopeless to being even more than you thought you ever could be. The force is with you. The force is within you. So summon it and be set free. Namaste.